Welcome to this journey into the shadows of forgotten America. I'm your host, and tonight we delve into one of Pennsylvania's most disturbing chapters, a story buried beneath layers of respectability and soil. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Are you watching this alone in the dark, perhaps during a quiet afternoon? Tell me in the comments below what time it is where you are, and whether you're brave enough to watch this alone. Your stories always fascinate me, and they remind me that these dark histories connect us all. The year is 1895. The place is Ashford, Pennsylvania, a modest town nestled in the Allegheny Mountains where coal dust mixed with morning fog, and the sound of train whistles marked the passage of time. It was an era of transformation, where gas lamps were giving way to electric lights, where horse-drawn carriages shared muddy roads with the occasional automobile, and where old superstitions still whispered in the corners of modern progress. Ashford was home to approximately 2,000 souls, most of them tied to the coal mines or the railway that connected this isolated community to Pittsburgh and beyond. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where church attendance on Sunday was mandatory for those who wished to maintain their reputation, and where the dead were buried with somber ceremony in the Oak Hill Cemetery, perched on a hillside overlooking the town. For 23 years, this cemetery had been maintained by one man, Harold Brennan. To the townspeople, Harold was a fixture of reliability, a man who performed his duties with quiet dignity. He tended the graves with meticulous care, ensured that headstones remained upright, and that the ground stayed presentable for grieving families. He was 57 years old, gray-haired, with a lean frame shaped by decades of manual labor. His wife, Margaret, was rarely seen in town, a ghost of a woman who some said was unwell, though no one knew exactly what afflicted her. Harold lived in the keeper's cottage, a small stone building at the edge of the cemetery grounds, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches seemed to reach toward the graves like skeletal fingers. Smoke rose from the cottage's chimney even in summer, and locals assumed Harold simply preferred warmth, or perhaps that Margaret's mysterious illness required constant heat. But in the autumn of 1895, everything changed. It began with a discovery that would shake Ashford to its foundations. On October the 17th, a group of boys playing near the cemetery's oldest section stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. A partially opened crypt, one that belonged to the Whitmore family, wealthy mine owners who'd been buried there for generations. The heavy stone door, which should have been sealed, stood slightly ajar. What the boys saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They ran to town, barely coherent, speaking of things that made no sense. Candles, fresh flowers, disturbed coffins, and something else, something they couldn't quite articulate through their terror and confusion. The town marshal, James Caudle, a veteran of the Civil War who thought he'd seen every horror mankind could produce, went to investigate. What he found in that crypt began an investigation that would reveal a darkness so profound, so intimate and grotesque, that even today, more than a century later, the full truth remains disputed, hidden in sealed court. Documents and family secrets passed down through whispered warnings. This is the story of Harold Brennan, the cemetery keeper of Ashford, Pennsylvania. This is the story of the women who disappeared. This is the story of what was found beneath Oak Hill Cemetery, in chambers that were never meant to be discovered. And this is a story that asks a question that still echoes through time. How well do we really know the people we trust with our dead? What was found in those underground chambers would challenge everything the town of Ashford believed about decency, about trust, and about the man they had allowed to guard their most sacred ground for more than 2 decades. But before we descend into those depths, we must understand the world Harold Brennan inhabited, the customs that shaped him, and the isolation that perhaps created him. To understand the horror that unfolded in Ashford, we must first understand the world of 1895 Pennsylvania, a world vastly different from our own, yet disturbingly similar in its capacity for hidden evil. The 1890s marked a period of profound transformation in America. The Victorian era was at its height, bringing with it rigid social codes and an obsession with respectability that often masked darkness beneath polished surfaces. In small towns like Ashford, reputation was everything. A man's word was his bond, and a family's standing in the community could be destroyed by mere rumor. Pennsylvania, particularly its rural regions, existed in a strange, liminal space between old and new. While cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh embraced industrialization with steel mills and electric streetcars, places like Ashford remained tethered to older ways. Superstitions brought over by German and Irish immigrants mixed with Protestant severity, creating a culture of silence around anything deemed improper or shameful. The coal mines that sustained Ashford also sustained a culture of death. Mining accidents were common, sometimes killing. Dozens of men in a single collapse or explosion. The town had buried more than its share of young men, their bodies often mangled beyond recognition, sealed in coffins that were never opened for final viewing. Death was a constant companion, and perhaps this familiarity bred a certain numbness, a resignation that made people less likely to question irregularities. Oak Hill Cemetery had been established in 1872, during a period when rural cemeteries were becoming fashionable, seen as peaceful. Parks where the living could commune with nature while visiting the dead. The cemetery occupied 15 acres on a hillside, with sections divided by economic class. The wealthy had their family mausoleums and crypts, elaborate Gothic structures of granite and marble. The working class had simpler graves, marked by modest headstones. And then there were the paupers, buried in unmarked plots at the far edge of the grounds, where the land sloped down toward Blackwater Creek. Harold Brennan had assumed the position of cemetery keeper in 1872 at the age of 34. He had come to Ashford from somewhere back east, though accounts vary on exactly where. Some said Philadelphia, others claimed he'd worked at a cemetery in New York. What remained consistent in all accounts was that Harold came with impeccable references and a knowledge of groundskeeping and grave maintenance that impressed the cemetery board. He married Margaret Hollis in 1874, a local woman 23 years old, at the time known for her beauty and gentle nature. They had no children, which some in town attributed to Margaret's delicate health, though others whispered that the couple kept to themselves in an unnatural way, rarely attending social functions or church services. Margaret's transformation over the years troubled those who remembered her. The vibrant young woman slowly faded, becoming pale and withdrawn, eventually ceasing to appear in town at all. When asked, Harold would explain that his wife suffered from a nervous condition, that she preferred the quiet of their cottage, that the doctor had recommended rest and isolation. The cottage itself became a source of quiet speculation. It sat at the edge of the cemetery, a two-story stone structure that had originally housed groundskeeping tools but had been expanded when Harold took the position. He had added rooms, expanded the cellar, and installed heavy curtains that were always drawn. Locals who delivered supplies noted that the interior was dark, smelled strongly of chemicals that Harold explained were for embalming and preservation, and that Margaret was always upstairs, never greeting visitors. But Harold himself was a model citizen in his public duties. He maintained the cemetery beautifully, ensuring that grass was trimmed, leaves were raked, and graves were treated with dignity. He attended to burial services with appropriate solemnity, and families appreciated his attention to detail. When monuments needed repair, Harold took care of it personally. When graves settled and needed additional soil, he saw to it promptly. He also volunteered to handle certain difficult situations. When bodies needed to be exhumed for legal or family reasons, Harold managed the process with discretion. When paupers died with no family to claim them, Harold ensured they received decent burial. When the town experienced an outbreak of typhoid in 1887, Harold worked tirelessly to accommodate the increased number of burials, often working through the night. This dedication earned him respect and, crucially, trust. The cemetery board gave him almost complete autonomy. He had keys to every mausoleum and crypt. He had access to burial records. He decided where paupers would be buried and maintained those records himself. In retrospect, the people of Ashford would realize they had given Harold Brennan something dangerous: absolute authority over the dead, with minimal oversight, in an era when graves were rarely disturbed and questions were rarely asked. The culture of the time also played a crucial role. Death photography was common, with families posing alongside deceased loved ones for memorial portraits. Bodies were displayed in homes for viewing. The boundary between living and dead was different than it is today, more intimate, less clinical. Undertaking was still a relatively new profession, and many people handled their own dead, washing bodies, dressing them, sitting with them through the night before burial. In this context, Harold's close work with the deceased seemed less unusual. His expertise in preservation and preparation was valued. His willingness to handle tasks others found unpleasant was appreciated rather than questioned. The cemetery itself had features that, in hindsight, seemed designed for concealment. The oldest section, dating from the 1870s, included underground crypts for wealthy families, accessible by stone staircases that descended beneath ground level. These crypts were rarely visited, often locked, and generally opened only when a new family member needed to be interred. Blackwater Creek, which bordered the cemetery's eastern edge, was so named for the coal runoff that darkened its waters. The area near the creek was considered undesirable, prone to flooding, and was where the poorest residents were buried. Few people ventured there, and the thick growth of trees and undergrowth made it nearly impassable. Harold's cottage had a direct view of this section. His cellar, which he'd expanded over the years, connected to a root cellar that he claimed he used for storage. The cellar had a separate entrance, accessible from outside, which Harold explained was practical for moving heavy equipment and supplies. This was the world Harold Brennan had built over 23 years, a kingdom of the dead, where he reigned with complete authority, in a time and place where questions went unasked, and where a man's respectable facade was rarely challenged. But kingdoms built on secrets cannot stand forever. And in October 1895, the first cracks began to show. The discovery in the Whitmore family crypt came on October 17, 1895, a Thursday afternoon when autumn sun cast long shadows across Oak Hill Cemetery. 4 boys, ranging in age from 10 to 13, had been playing a game they called ghost hunting, daring each other to venture deeper into the oldest section of the cemetery, where the wealthiest families kept their elaborate mausoleums and underground crypts. The boys' names were Thomas Kendrick, Samuel Porter, William Hughes, and Joseph Farmer. Their testimony, recorded in Marshal Cordell's investigation notes, provides our first glimpse into what had been happening beneath the surface of Ashford's most sacred ground. Thomas Kendrick, the oldest at 13, told investigators that they had noticed the Whitmore crypt's door was not fully closed. The heavy bronze door, which should have been sealed with a lock, stood open perhaps 6 inches, enough to reveal darkness within, and more strangely, a faint glow that flickered like candlelight. The boys debated what to do. Samuel wanted to run immediately and tell someone. William insisted it was probably just reflection from the afternoon sun, but Joseph, the youngest and perhaps the bravest, pushed the door open wider and descended the first 3 steps. What he saw made him scramble backward so quickly he fell, bruising his hands on the stone steps. Inside the crypt, which should have contained only the sealed coffins of the Whitmore family, were signs of recent presence. Candles, not ancient and dust-covered, but fresh white candles, recently burned, their wax still soft. Fresh flowers, autumn roses and chrysanthemums, arranged in a pattern on the floor, and most disturbingly, one of the coffins had been opened. The boys ran. They ran until they reached Main Street, where Thomas, breathless and pale, found his father outside the general store and gasped out their discovery. Within an hour, Marshal James Cordell, accompanied by Dr. Edwin Marsh and Reverend Samuel Clark, made their way to Oak Hill Cemetery. Marshal Cordell's official report, which I accessed through the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives, describes what they found with clinical precision that barely masks his horror. The Whitmore crypt contained the remains of 8 family members, dating back to 1874. The coffin that had been disturbed belonged to Elizabeth Whitmore, who had died in 1892 at the age of 26. The coffin lid had been carefully removed and set aside. The body, which should have been decomposed after 3 years of burial, showed signs of preservation that Dr. Marsh noted as inconsistent with natural processes. More concerning were the items found inside the crypt. A wooden chair, positioned near Elizabeth's coffin, a small table with the remnants of the candles the boys had seen, a journal, leather-bound, containing entries written in a precise hand, and clothing, women's clothing, folded neatly in a corner, including items that clearly did not date from the 1890s but appeared to be contemporary garments. Dr. Marsh examined Elizabeth Whitmore's remains and concluded that someone had been treating the body with preservative chemicals, likely formaldehyde and arsenic compounds, substances that Harold Brennan would have had ready access to in his work as cemetery keeper. The journal was perhaps the most disturbing discovery. The first entry was dated May 1893, more than 2 years before the discovery, and was written in what handwriting experts would later confirm was Harold Brennan's distinctive script. The entries spoke of visits and time spent in contemplation. They described Elizabeth Whitmore in terms that, even in the euphemistic language of the Victorian era, clearly indicated an obsession that crossed every boundary of decency. Harold wrote of her beauty, of how well she had been preserved, of how she seemed to him more peaceful in death than any living person he had encountered. But Elizabeth Whitmore was not the only name in the journal. There were references to others: MS 1889, CR 1891, AB 1894. Each set of initials was accompanied by dates and cryptic notes about successful preservation and private moments. Marshal Cordell immediately sent for Harold Brennan. A deputy was dispatched to the keeper's cottage with orders to bring Harold in for questioning, but when the deputy arrived at the cottage, he found something unexpected. Margaret Brennan answered the door. She appeared confused, disoriented, and, according to the deputy's report, seemed not to understand what was being asked of her. When asked where her husband was, she simply stated that Harold was with his ladies and would return by evening as he always did. Harold was found 3 hours later, working in the newer section of the cemetery, tending to a fresh grave. He showed no alarm when approached by Marshal Cordell, no surprise at the questions. Instead, he asked calmly if they had found his journal, and when Cordell confirmed they had, Harold simply nodded and said, "Then I suppose you'll want to see the others." The others. That phrase would haunt everyone involved in the investigation. Harold led Marshal Cordell, Dr. Marsh, and a growing group of townspeople to his cottage. He asked only that Margaret be taken to stay with neighbors, saying she was fragile and not responsible for any of this. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a respected woman in town, took Margaret to her home, where Margaret reportedly sat in silence, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering phrases that made no sense. At the cottage, Harold unlocked the cellar door with a key he kept on a chain around his neck. The cellar stairs descended into darkness, and Harold lit a lamp before leading the group down. The cellar had been converted into something that resembled a workshop, but its purpose was immediately horrifyingly clear. Tables lined the walls, covered with bottles of chemicals, preservation tools, and detailed notes on embalming techniques. But it was the back wall that drew everyone's attention. What appeared to be a solid stone wall was actually a false front. Harold reached behind a shelf and pulled a lever. The wall swung inward, revealing a passageway carved through rock and earth, leading deeper underground. Tell me in the comments what you think they found in that passage. What do you imagine Harold had created beneath Oak Hill Cemetery? Your theories always fascinate me, and as this story continues, you'll see just how close to the truth your darkest imaginings might be. Harold, showing no emotion, no shame, no fear, simply said, "I've been working on this for many years. You should understand, I meant no harm. I gave them more care than they ever received in life. I loved them." The passage descended at a gentle slope, supported by timber, beams that Harold had clearly installed with great care. The walls were carved from the natural rock and clay of the hillside. After approximately 30 feet, the passage opened into a chamber. The chamber was 15 feet wide and 20 feet long, carved out beneath the oldest section of the cemetery, and it was occupied. 6 preparation tables constructed of wood and metal, 6 bodies in various states of preservation. 4 women and 2 young girls positioned as if sleeping, dressed in clean white gowns, their hair arranged, their hands folded across their chests. Dr. Marsh later wrote that the scene was beyond comprehension, a perversion so complete that it challenged the rational mind to process what the eyes witnessed. But the chamber held more secrets. Further back, another passage, narrower, leading to additional spaces. How deep did Harold's underground kingdom extend? How many dead had he taken? How long had this been happening? The investigation had only just begun. The chamber beneath Harold Brennan's cottage was only the beginning. Over the following days, as investigators mapped the underground passages Harold had constructed over more than 2 decades, the true scope of his activities became horrifyingly clear. Harold had created an underground network that extended beneath a significant portion of Oak Hill Cemetery, connecting multiple chambers, each serving a different purpose in his macabre activities. The main passage from his cottage cellar led to what investigators called the preparation room, where the 6 bodies had been found. But 3 additional passages branched from this central chamber, each revealing new horrors. The first branch, extending north, led to what Harold had set up as a storage area. Here, investigators found dozens of items removed from graves, jewelry, photographs, locks of hair, pieces of clothing, all meticulously labeled with names and dates. Harold had kept records of everything, cross-referenced with burial, dates and locations. Dr. Marsh noted that the organization was disturbingly meticulous, the work of a man who saw his activities not as perverse, but as a form of scholarship. Among the items were personal effects from women who had been buried over the past 20 years. Wedding rings, lockets, mourning brooches, prayer books inscribed with names. Each item represented a person Harold had violated, a family that had entrusted their loved one to his care, unaware of what would happen after the funeral ended and mourners departed. The second passage led to what could only be described as Harold's private sanctum. This chamber, smaller than the preparation room, had been furnished with items clearly taken from the keeper's cottage above. A comfortable chair, a writing desk, oil lamps, and shelves containing books on anatomy, embalming techniques, and disturbingly poetry collections and romantic literature. Here, investigators found more journals dating back to 1874, the year Harold married Margaret. These journals provided a window into Harold's deteriorating mind, his growing obsession with the dead, and his conviction that he was somehow providing care and love to those who had been abandoned by the living. In an entry from 1877, Harold wrote, "Margaret does not understand my work. She sees only death where I see eternal beauty. The living age and decay become bitter and worn. But these angels in my care remain perfect, unchanging, grateful for my devotion." The third passage was the most disturbing of all. It led to a series of smaller chambers, crypts that Harold had secretly connected to existing family vaults. Through careful excavation over years, he had created hidden access points to at least 12 crypts in the cemetery's oldest section. This explained how he had been able to access bodies without breaking locks or leaving obvious signs of disturbance. Marshal Cordell's investigation revealed that Harold would wait until a family buried a loved one. Then weeks or months later, he would access the crypt through his hidden passages, remove the body, treat it with preservatives, and either return it to the crypt or, in cases where he became particularly obsessed, bring it to his underground chambers. The bodies found in Harold's preparation room were identified as follows: Emma Sullivan, died 1889, age 24. Catherine Riley, died 1891, age 28. Anna Brennan, no relation, died 1894, age 19. Rebecca Foster, died 1895, age 31. Sarah Mills, age 12, died 1893, and Grace Patterson, age 14, died 1894. Dr. Marsh's examination concluded that Harold had become increasingly sophisticated in his preservation techniques, using combinations of formaldehyde, arsenic, and other chemicals to maintain the bodies in states of preservation that were, from a purely technical standpoint, remarkable for the era. But the question that haunted investigators was not how Harold had done this, but why. What drove a man to create this underground kingdom? What satisfaction did he derive from these violations? And perhaps most troubling, had he done anything beyond preservation? The journals would provide some answers, though the answers would only deepen the horror. Harold Brennan's journals, spanning from 1874 to 1895, were extensive, filling more than 30 volumes. Reverend Clark was tasked with reviewing them, as it was felt that a man of God might be best equipped to process the contents while maintaining some objectivity. What he found was a gradual descent into obsession, rationalization, and ultimately a complete break from normal human boundaries. The early journals, from 1874 to 1880, focused primarily on Harold's work as cemetery keeper, noting burial procedures, maintenance tasks, and payments received. But interspersed among these practical entries were increasingly personal observations about the people he buried, particularly young women. In 1878, Harold wrote about a young woman named Clara Donovan, who had died of consumption at age 22. Clara was laid to rest today. Even in death, there is a serenity to her features that life often obscures. I ensured her hair was arranged properly, as her mother's hands trembled too much to do so. The family was grateful, though they could not know how carefully I attended to every detail, how I wished to preserve this moment of peace forever. By 1882, Harold's entries revealed a growing dissatisfaction with his marriage to Margaret. He wrote of her constant need for attention, her inability to understand the importance of my work, and his feeling that the living make demands that the dead never would. The first clear indication of Harold's violations appeared in 1883 in an entry dated October 15th. I returned to visit Sarah T. tonight. I know it is unusual, perhaps others would not understand, but I feel a responsibility to ensure she remains at peace. I brought fresh flowers and sat with her for several hours. There is a companionship in these visits that I cannot explain to anyone, least of all to Margaret. Sarah T. was Sarah Thompson, who had died in 1882 at age 27. Her crypt was one of the first Harold accessed through his hidden passages. Over the following years, the journals documented Harold's construction of the underground chambers, his experimentation with preservation techniques, and his growing conviction that he was engaged in something noble rather than perverse. He wrote extensively about rescuing the dead from abandonment, about how families grieved briefly, then forgot, while he maintained eternal devotion. In 1887, Harold's journals revealed that Margaret discovered something about his activities. The entry from August 3, 1887 reads, "Margaret found the passage today. She descended and saw Catherine. I had to explain everything, though I knew she would not understand. She became hysterical, speaking of police and damnation. I have given her medicine to calm her nerves. She will understand in time that I mean no harm." This medicine was likely laudanum, a tincture of opium commonly used in the era. Subsequent entries suggest Harold began regularly administering laudanum to Margaret, gradually increasing the dosage to keep her docile and compliant. This explained Margaret's deterioration over the years, her transformation from a vibrant young woman to a ghost-like presence rarely seen by townspeople. The most disturbing journals were those from 1890 onward. Harold's entries became increasingly romantic in tone, describing his relationships with the dead women in his care as if they were willing participants. He wrote of conversations he had with them, of how he would read poetry aloud, of how he imagined they appreciated his attention. In 1893, writing about Elizabeth Whitmore, Harold stated, "Elizabeth is perfection. I have never seen such beauty, even in death, especially in death. She does not judge, does not demand, does not age or change or disappoint. I visit her 3 times weekly. I have arranged her hair in the style I imagined she would have preferred. I believe she understands my devotion." But the journals also contained something else, something that expanded the investigation beyond violation of the dead. Scattered among Harold's entries were references to the special ones, women who he claimed came to him before they died, whom he helped transition peacefully. These cryptic references suggested a possibility too, horrible to immediately voice. Had Harold not only violated the dead, but potentially hastened the deaths of some of his victims? Margaret Brennan's mental state had deteriorated so severely by the time of Harold's arrest that authorities initially believed she would be unable to provide useful testimony. Years of laudanum use had left her confused and fragile, often unable to distinguish between past and present. However, Dr. Marsh, working with a specialist in nervous disorders from Pittsburgh, gradually reduced Margaret's laudanum dosage over several weeks, allowing her mind to clear somewhat. What emerged was testimony that painted a picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare, aware of her husband's depravity, but rendered powerless by fear, drugs, and social circumstances. Margaret's testimony, given in late November 1895 at the home of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, was recorded by a court stenographer. She spoke in a quiet, halting voice, often pausing for long periods or becoming confused about dates and sequences of events. Margaret stated that she first became aware of Harold's unusual interest in the dead within a year of their marriage. She noticed he would spend hours in the cemetery after dark, explaining that he was performing maintenance that was easier in cooler evening temperatures. She accepted this explanation initially, though she found his return time increasingly late. In 1877, Margaret found Harold's first journal hidden in his desk. Reading it, she confronted him about the inappropriate nature of his writings about deceased women. Harold became angry, telling her that she lacked the sophistication to understand the philosophical aspects of his work. He insisted that his care for the dead was no different than a doctor's care for patients or a priest's care for souls. Margaret wanted to tell someone to seek help, But who would believe her? Harold was respected in the community. She was a woman with no family nearby, no independent means, completely dependent on her husband, and Harold reminded her of this constantly. In 1883, Harold began excavating beneath the cottage cellar. He told Margaret he was creating storage space. She knew this was untrue, but by then Harold had begun giving her medicine for her nervous condition, medicine that made her drowsy and compliant. The day Margaret discovered the underground chambers in 1887 remained vivid in her memory, even years later. She had descended into the cellar searching for canning jars and found the hidden door open. Following the passage, she entered the preparation room and saw Catherine Riley's body laid out on a table, preserved, dressed in a white gown. Margaret screamed, ran back to the cottage, and told Harold she would go to the authorities. Harold's response was calm and chilling. He explained that if she told anyone, he would claim she was insane, that her nervous condition had progressed to delusions. Who would believe a sickly, isolated woman over a respected cemetery keeper? Moreover, he implied that Margaret's knowledge of his activities, even without participation, might make her complicit in the eyes of the law. That night, Harold gave Margaret a larger dose of laudanum than usual. When she woke the next morning, Harold sat beside her bed and explained that he had increased her medicine dosage for her own good, to help her forget disturbing dreams and remain calm. He would continue providing this medicine daily, and she would remain in the cottage, away from town, where she might say something inappropriate that people might misinterpret. For the next 8 years, Margaret lived as a prisoner in her own home, kept in a state of semi-consciousness by daily doses of laudanum, aware of what was happening in the chambers below her cottage, but powerless to stop it. Margaret's testimony also revealed something else. There were women who had come to the cottage while still alive, women who Harold had treated for various ailments, offering them restorative tonics and therapeutic treatments. Some of these women died shortly afterward, their deaths attributed to their existing illnesses. Margaret believed Harold had poisoned at least 3 women, though she had no proof beyond her suspicions and fragments of overheard conversations. Marshal Cordell's investigation expanded to examine every burial Harold Brennan had overseen during his 23 years as cemetery keeper. The task was monumental, involving the review of hundreds of burial records, interviews with dozens of families, and the difficult decision of whether to exhume bodies to determine if they showed signs of post-burial disturbance. The cemetery board authorized the exhumation of 15 bodies, chosen based on Harold's journal entries and Margaret's testimony. Dr. Marsh, assisted by Dr. Thomas Woodward from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, conducted examinations that confirmed disturbing patterns. 7 of the 15 exhumed bodies showed signs of Harold's preservation techniques, unusual chemical residues, evidence of post-burial treatment, and in 2 cases, bodies that were far better preserved than natural decomposition should have allowed. This provided physical evidence supporting the journal entries and Margaret's testimony, but the investigation also uncovered something potentially more sinister. 3 women whose deaths Harold had mentioned in his journals as peaceful transitions showed, upon examination, traces of what Dr. Woodward identified as possible arsenic poisoning. Arsenic, common in embalming practices, could also be used to mimic natural death from various illnesses. The 3 women were Martha Hayes, who died in 1888 at age 29, supposedly from heart failure; Louise Bennett, who died in 1890 at age 26, supposedly from pneumonia; and Dorothy Walsh, who died in 1892 at age 31, supposedly from a stomach ailment. All 3 had been healthy until suddenly falling ill after visiting Harold's cottage. Martha Hayes had gone to ask Harold about arranging her grandmother's burial. Louise Bennett had delivered baked goods, a kindness to Harold and Margaret. Dorothy Walsh had sought Harold's advice about maintaining her family's burial plot. Each woman accepted tea or a tonic from Harold. Each fell ill within days. Each died within 2 weeks of visiting the cottage. Each was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery, where Harold had unlimited access to their graves. Dr. Woodward's findings were suggestive but not conclusive. Arsenic detection in exhumed bodies was difficult, and other explanations could account for the chemical traces. However, the pattern was disturbing, and it expanded Harold's alleged crimes from violation of the dead to possible serial murder. The question became, had Harold killed women in order to add them to his underground collection? Had his obsession progressed from violating those already dead to creating his own victims? Harold, when questioned about these women, maintained that their deaths were natural, that he had merely been kind to them before their passing, and that any post-mortem attention he gave them was an extension of that kindness. He refused to admit to murder, though he openly acknowledged and even defended his preservation and violation of their bodies after burial. The legal challenges were significant. While Harold's violations of the dead were clear crimes, Pennsylvania law in 1895 lacked specific statutes addressing the full extent of his actions. Grave robbing was a crime, as was abuse of a corpse, but the penalties were relatively minor, typically fines or short jail sentences. The potential murder charges offered more serious consequences, but the evidence was circumstantial. No witness had seen Harold administer poison. No one could definitively prove that arsenic traces in decades-old exhumed bodies came from Harold's hand rather than embalming processes or environmental contamination. Prosecutors decided to pursue multiple charges: grave robbery, abuse of corpses, unlawful imprisonment of Margaret, and 3 counts of murder. The trial was scheduled for January 1896, and the entire town of Ashford waited with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. The trial of Harold Brennan began on January 13, 1896, in the Allegheny County Courthouse. It lasted 3 weeks and drew spectators from across Pennsylvania and beyond. Newspapers from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia covered every detail, their headlines screaming about the Ghoul of Oak Hill and Pennsylvania's most depraved criminal. Harold showed no emotion throughout the proceedings. He sat calmly, occasionally taking notes, sometimes appearing almost bored. When asked to explain his actions, he spoke in the same measured tone he had used when discussing cemetery maintenance with the board. "I loved them," he told the court. "I cared for them with more devotion than their own families. Showed. The living grieve briefly, then forget. I never forgot. I gave them immortality through preservation, companionship through my visits, dignity in death that they never knew in life." The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges of grave robbery and corpse abuse. Guilty on the unlawful imprisonment of Margaret, but could not reach unanimous agreement on the murder charges. The evidence, while suggestive, was deemed insufficient for conviction beyond reasonable doubt. Harold Brennan was sentenced to 30 years in Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh. Margaret was not charged with any crime, deemed a victim of her husband's abuse and coercion. She was placed in the care of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, where physicians hoped to help her recover from years of forced laudanum addiction. Harold died in prison in 1903 at age 65 from pneumonia. Prison records indicate he spent his final years writing extensively, producing volumes of text that prison officials described as philosophical treatises on death, beauty, and eternal preservation. These writings were ordered destroyed by the warden, who deemed them too disturbing to preserve. Margaret Brennan remained institutionalized until her death in 1908. According to hospital records, she never fully recovered her mental faculties, remaining in a state of confusion and terror until the end. Her final words, recorded by a nurse, were, "He's still with them. He'll never leave them alone." The keeper's cottage was torn down in 1896, and the underground chambers were sealed with concrete. The cemetery board hired a new keeper, instituted strict oversight procedures, and attempted to move past the horror that had unfolded beneath their watch. But the story didn't end there. Over the following decades, strange incidents at Oak Hill Cemetery kept Harold Brennan's memory alive in whispered conversations and local legends. In 1923, a groundskeeper reported finding candles burning in the Whitmore crypt, despite it being locked and sealed since 1895. Investigation revealed no signs of forced entry, and the incident was dismissed as a prank, though no one could explain how pranksters had access to sealed crypt. In 1947, Professor Arthur Mullins from Carnegie Mellon University, researching early American cemetery practices, obtained permission to examine historical records at Oak Hill. While reviewing burial ledgers in the cemetery office, he discovered a discrepancy. Harold's personal records indicated 847 burials during his tenure, but official town records showed only 839. 8 burials were unaccounted for. Mullins spent months trying to trace the missing burials. He found references to pauper graves in Harold's handwriting, noting locations near Blackwater Creek, but no corresponding entries in official records. When he investigated the area, he found that the ground near the creek had settled in several locations, creating depressions that suggested graves beneath. Mullins requested permission to excavate, but the cemetery board denied his request, citing concerns about disturbing what might be human remains without clear evidence of wrongdoing. The identity and fate of those 8 missing burials remains unknown. In 1961, during renovation of the Oak Hill Cemetery office, workers discovered a metal box hidden beneath floorboards. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, dating from the 1880s and 1890s. The photographs showed women in repose, eyes closed, hands folded, dressed in white gowns. Some were clearly taken in crypts or underground chambers. Others showed locations that couldn't be identified. On the back of each photograph, in Harold's distinctive handwriting, were names, dates, and brief notes. Emma, forever beautiful, 1889. Catherine, at peace, 1891. Elizabeth, my dearest, 1892. Most disturbing were 3 photographs that couldn't be matched to any known victims from Harold's trial. 3 women preserved and photographed whose identities remain unknown. Were they among the 8 missing burials? Were they victims from before Harold came to Ashford? The photographs raised more questions than they answered. In 1975, during construction of a new residential development near the former location of Harold's cottage, construction workers uncovered a section of collapsed underground passage that had not been discovered in 1895. The passage extended further east than investigators had mapped, suggesting Harold's underground network was more extensive than anyone realized. Inside this newly discovered section, workers found a chamber containing 6 stone platforms, empty but stained with chemicals. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved organs, each jar labeled with initials and dates. Some dated from as early as 1876, just 4 years after Harold became cemetery keeper. This discovery suggested Harold's activities had begun far earlier than his. Journals indicated that his early victims had been completely hidden, their violations never discovered during the original investigation. The local historical society attempted to research the initials on the organ jars, trying to match them with burial records. But many records from the 1870s were incomplete or had been lost over time. Of the 23 sets of initials found, only 11 could be definitively matched to known burials. In 1989, Margaret Brennan's diary was discovered, Among archived items at the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, the diary, which Margaret had somehow kept hidden during her institutionalization, provided new insights into her years with Harold. In entries from the late 1880s, Margaret wrote about hearing voices from the cellar, about Harold bringing guests to the cottage late at night, about the smell of chemicals that permeated their home. She also wrote about her growing dependence on laudanum, how she both craved and feared it, how it was the only thing that allowed her to sleep despite knowing what was happening beneath her. Most chillingly, Margaret wrote about women who visited the cottage, women whom Harold would greet with unusual warmth, offering them tea or tonics. Margaret recorded names: Martha Hayes, Louise Bennett, Dorothy Walsh, and others. Some she recognized as women who later died and were buried in Oak Hill. Others were names that appeared in no burial records, women who perhaps left town or were buried elsewhere, or whose fates remain unknown. The diary's final entry, dated October 1895, just days before Harold's discovery, read, "I prayed for God to stop him. I prayed for courage to stop him myself. I prayed for death to release me. God answered none of these prayers. Perhaps there is no God in this house, only Harold and his angels of death. Perhaps I am already dead, and this is my punishment for silence." In 2003, the television series Unsolved Mysteries featured a segment on Harold Brennan, interviewing descendants of victims and local historians. During research for the episode, producers discovered that 5 women who had been buried in Oak Hill during Harold's tenure had been exhumed by their families in the early 1900s for reburial elsewhere. All 5 families cited the same reason: persistent nightmares and a feeling that their loved ones were not at rest in Oak Hill. None of these families had been victims identified in Harold's original trial, suggesting his violations extended beyond the cases prosecutors had pursued. More than a century has passed since Harold Brennan's arrest, yet the full truth of what happened beneath Oak Hill Cemetery remains elusive, buried as deeply as the victims he violated. The official count stands at 17 confirmed victims, the 6 bodies found in his underground chambers, the 8 whose exhumed remains showed evidence of his preservation techniques, and the 3 women possibly murdered to feed his obsession. But the evidence discovered in subsequent decades suggests this number is tragically incomplete. The 8 missing burials from Professor Mullins's research, the unidentified women in the photographs found in 1961, the 12 unmatched sets of initials on organ jars from 1975, the women Margaret mentioned in her diary who then disappeared from records. If all these represent additional victims, Harold's depravity affected not 17, but potentially dozens of women and girls. Several theories have emerged over the years, each attempting to explain Harold Brennan's transformation from cemetery keeper to serial violator of the dead, and possibly the living. The first theory suggests Harold suffered from a recognized psychological condition now called necrophilia, driven by an inability to form relationships with living women and a need for complete control. Proponents of this theory point to Harold's writings about the dead being more perfect than the living, never aging, changing, or disappointing him. They note his troubled marriage to Margaret, his isolation, and his apparent lack of empathy for his victims' families. The second theory, popular among local historians, suggests Harold's crimes were rooted in the death culture of the Victorian era. The proximity to death that characterized his profession, combined with the era's romanticization of death and the common practice of death photography and extended viewing of bodies, may have gradually warped his perceptions, until he could no longer distinguish between appropriate care of the dead and violation. The third theory, the darkest, suggests Harold was not simply violating those already dead, but actively creating victims. The evidence of possible arsenic poisoning, Margaret's diary entries about women who visited the cottage, and the 8 missing burials all point to the possibility that Harold murdered women to add them to his collection. In this theory, Harold was not just a necrophile, but a serial killer who found the perfect cover in his profession. Some researchers have noted similarities between Harold's case and other historical cases of cemetery workers and undertakers who violated the dead. Carl Tanzler in Florida, who preserved and lived with a deceased woman in the 1930s. The case of Alan Poindexter in California in the 1940s. These cases suggest that positions involving close contact with the dead may attract or create individuals with similar pathologies. But perhaps the most disturbing question is not about Harold, but about the system that enabled him. How did he operate for more than 20 years without discovery? Why did no one question his extensive access to graves, his underground construction, his wife's deterioration, the missing burial records? The answer lies partly in the trust placed in respectable positions, the reluctance of Victorian society to question authority or suspect evil in familiar faces, and the isolation of victims who were already dead, and therefore unable to speak for themselves. Oak Hill Cemetery still operates today, though under different management and with strict oversight procedures implemented after Harold's exposure. The section where his cottage stood remains undeveloped, left as a memorial to his victims. A simple stone marker erected in 1996 on the centennial of his trial reads, "In memory of those whose rest was disturbed, may they finally find peace." But locals report that the area around the former cottage site remains unsettling. Visitors describe feeling watched, hearing sounds with no source, experiencing sudden drops in temperature. Whether these phenomena are psychological responses to knowing the location's history or something more unexplainable, they ensure that Harold Brennan's crimes have not been forgotten. The families of identified victims, including descendants now several generations removed, continue to grapple with their ancestors' violations. Some have had their loved ones exhumed and reburied elsewhere. Others have left them at Oak Hill, arguing that moving them again would be yet another disturbance, another violation. To this day, no one knows the full extent of Harold Brennan's crimes. The sealed chambers beneath Oak Hill may still hold secrets. The missing burials may represent victims lost to history. The unidentified women in photographs may never be named, and the question of whether Harold murdered to feed his obsession may never be definitively answered. What we do know is that for more than 2 decades, the people of Ashford, Pennsylvania, trusted a monster with their dead. They gave him keys, authority, and unsupervised access, never imagining that respectability could mask such profound depravity. Harold Brennan's case reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a respectable face, performs its duties efficiently, and hides its true nature beneath layers of normalcy until, almost by accident, someone looks beneath the surface and discovers the horror that was always there. The next time you visit a cemetery, the next time you trust someone in a position of authority over those who cannot protect themselves, remember Harold Brennan. Remember that vigilance and oversight exist, not because we distrust everyone, but because history has shown us what can happen when we trust too completely. Before we end, I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened beneath Oak Hill Cemetery? Do you believe Harold was just violating the already dead, or do you think he created victims to feed his obsession? How many women do you think truly suffered at his hands? Leave your theories in the comments below. Let's discuss this in our haunted community. If you found this story as disturbing and fascinating as I did researching it, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We delve into forgotten horrors every week, bringing you true crime and dark history that deserves to be remembered even when it's easier to forget. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Pennsylvania's darkest chapters. Until next time, remember that history's monsters often look just like everyone else until someone finally looked close enough to see the truth. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next investigation.